And hello, welcome to the Social Justice Forum. I am Daren, Jaime. We thank you for joining us. Now, if you're asking the question, what is the show all about? We bring you a forum discussing and providing deeper understanding on the issues and inequities that so many people and communities face. Things from systemic inequalities to pressing social problems. Our guests provide multiple perspectives as well as insights, helping us to better understand and address the challenges. Well, for you, we invite you right now to stay with us. The Social Justice Forum starts now. And we are back. The New York legislature has passed the Equal Rights Amendment for a second consecutive session, paving the way for New Yorkers to vote on it in the November 2024 ballot. The amendment is set to transform our state's legal framework by prohibiting discrimination based on ethnicity, national origin, age, disability, and sex. Here now, the Deputy Director and Legislative Director of the League of Women Voters of New York, Erica Smitka. And Erica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, as we're on the precipice of this, talk to me about what all this means.
Absolutely. So this is really a critical moment for New Yorkers. It'll be the first time that New Yorkers in November will have the ability to guarantee our own rights and freedoms within our state constitution. Those rights and freedoms are permanently protected and not up to the whims of politicians, like we are unfortunately seeing in so many states across the country. So it's going to be a big moment. You did a great job giving a synopsis of what that amendment will mean to so many New Yorkers. We're really looking forward for voters to have that opportunity to vote in November.
Let's unpack the amendment. I gave a little bit of an intro to it, but for somebody who's looking for a little bit more depth in it, let's unpack it now. So
yeah, sure.
My fault. No, I'll let you go ahead. I thought I should have said a little bit more, but you go right ahead.
No, I'll just say that this amendment is so broad and so inclusive that it will truly have, too many impacts for me to be able to detail on on the show today. But I can give a few examples of what this might mean for New Yorkers. And essentially, what this amendment will do is it'll ensure that laws will not be able to be passed that could discriminate against New Yorkers solely based on their identity. So, for example, the New York State ERA would keep the state from passing a statewide abortion ban, or banning private insurance coverage of abortion, or prosecuting or criminalizing folks solely based on pregnancy outcomes, like a miscarriage, et cetera, et cetera. And those are just a few examples of how this amendment would protect folks within the sphere of our reproductive rights. But it gives you a good idea of just how this might affect New Yorkers in their everyday lives.
We presently have these anti-discrimination laws that are currently in place. I mean, we'll talk about, there are existing statutes out there, but talk to us about the necessity of why we need to see the ERA in New York, given the fact that we've got these discriminatory statutes.
Absolutely. So we are lucky to live in a state that has such robust state laws when it comes to discrimination, robust and expansive state laws. But that being said, these are just laws, right? And so by ensuring that these rights and freedoms are codified within our Constitution, it would protect those rights from being changed solely based on, the political whims of who may be in power at this time. So, for example, our last gubernatorial election, we saw an anti-choice politician was mere points away from winning that election and becoming governor of New York State. And so you can see how just one election can really change the tide in New York. And we've got to make sure that these rights and protections are in our Constitution so that that's not a worry or a fear for New Yorkers.
One concern that I know that comes with the ERA is that of pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes. When we talk about that issue in particular, how can we really unpack that from the perspective of how is it protected, particularly for those who are pregnant and dealing with pregnancy outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question, because this is something that we're seeing, as I said, we're seeing it more and more in states across this country, unfortunately. And it really can be the criminalization of something like a miscarriage can be absolutely devastating to folks. So I know I noted some of these earlier, but this amendment would ensure that New York State could not pass laws such as a statewide abortion ban or adding medically unnecessary burdens on patients or providers who might be seeking an abortion or who may have a miscarriage, or it would not allow for New York to be able to criminalize or prosecute someone solely based on those pregnancy outcomes, like a miscarriage. So it truly, would be great. And, not only does this address reproductive health, but as you noted earlier, it pertains to so many different classes and communities of New Yorkers, and will have, wide sweeping effects.
We have on our side a lot of, marginalized people within the community, and that marginalized population is really concerned about the impact, the potential impact that this will have. Talk to me about that particular issue of the marginalized community and how you see this playing out.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways in which this can play out, and I guess the one thing I want to emphasize is that this is not a new law in New York State, right? We already have these really robust, as we talked about, laws against discrimination and protections for New Yorkers. But this would really just enforce, solidify those laws protecting New Yorkers within our Constitution. And so what that looks like can take many shapes and many forms. Again, I think to go back to reproductive rights and reproductive health care, we quite often see the most marginalized members of our communities who are the ones in the center of these discussions in states where folks are being criminalized for miscarriages or for getting an abortion. And so to be able to defend the rights of all New Yorkers based on, the number of communities that are protected, this really would, as I said, could take many forms, but that's just one small example.
Yeah. And I think at the same time, we're talking along those lines, there's a lot of people who are concerned when it comes to the issue of civil rights and the possibility of seeing that rollback of what's going on. A lot of progress has been made down through the years. We know recently a lot of rights have been challenged and a lot of rights are really up for grabs in some way, shape, or form. Talk to me about the ERA and the rollback of civil rights.
Yeah, I want to take the words you just used, that those rights are up for grabs, and that's exactly what we're seeing happen, right? We're seeing, especially after the Dobbs decision, we're seeing that rights that are not explicitly protected in states across our country are being taken away in, one way, shape, or form, and that again goes right back to all different communities within New York State. So currently our Constitution includes protections for race and religion, but as you said, this amendment would expand those protections to include ethnicity, national origin, age, disability, sex, and that list goes on. And so again, there's a lot of different ways in which this could protect folks using that civil rights lens or angle.
When I, used the word up for grabs, it was definitely intentional because I know that it really boils down to this. Who gets to the polls, who votes, who's actually going to be going out there and making a difference by pulling that, we used to say pull the lever, right? But now it's so electronic, right? But really getting to the ballot box and making their vote heard. I want to talk about this here because that's another thing about the League of Women Voters we have to talk about is advocacy. There's a lot of work that's being done to really engage people to get boots on the ground, to get out, to be able to vote, so that way these rights are not taken back or we see these potential rollbacks.
Exactly. And we know that we know broadly, based especially on a study that was done in 2022, that New Yorkers support this amendment. Almost 80% of New Yorkers would support an amendment like this that protects against discrimination. And as you said, each and every day, right? We're pounding the pavement in counties across the state to turn out educated voters and turn out voters who know that when they get to the polling booth, they've got to flip that ballot in order to vote on the New York ERA. Voters who know, exactly what they can expect to see on their ballot, make sure they get there on election day, or during that early voting time period to make sure that their vote and their voice is heard. And the League is a part of a really robust coalition, the New Yorkers for Equal Rights Coalition, which is made up of hundreds of organizations working across the state to do just that, right? To educate folks on the New York Equal Rights Amendment and to activate folks to get out and vote this November.
Well, if the Equal Rights Amendment does have its way and passes through in New York State, what kind of potential ramifications are we looking at nationwide? If New York State does it, what can we see across this country?
So New York, as we've been in the past, we like to see ourselves as a leader, and that's exactly what we're hoping to do with this amendment. Really lead the way on one of the most expansive amendments to a state constitution nationwide. And it's so expansive because it, again, includes all of those communities that are essential to making New York the state that we are. And so we're hoping that by passing this amendment, having the voters approve this amendment here in New York State, we can lead the way for other states to follow suit and pass similar amendments within their own constitutions.
And Erica, for yourself, a little bit of a more personal, how does it line up, the ERAs, I should say, what goes on in the ERA, how does it line up along with the mission and the vision of the League of Women Voters?
Yeah, the League has been fighting since 1919 to protect the rights. We started working to protect the right of women to vote, and we've continued to protect the rights not only of women, but of all New Yorkers and all folks in the United States. We're a nationwide organization. So this amendment really goes back to the heart of who we are and what we do. It's protecting those rights and those freedoms for everybody, and for all New Yorkers, and now for all voters. So this definitely, pulls at the heartstrings of the League, and we've got a lot of members on the ground across the state who are really actively engaged in making sure this amendment gets passed in November.
This seems like a common sense, no-brainer thing to happen, right? But yet and still we understand that there's a lot of possibility that it won't. I guess the question would be, from my perspective, is why? What are we seeing out there that maybe you want to speak to?
Sure. So we're seeing a sect of it's really a small sect of an anti-choice minority group of folks that are looking to push back on this amendment, and that would like to see this amendment off the ballot in November. And that's just what it is. It really is just a minority of folks here in New York State who want to ensure that New Yorkers don't solidify their rights and access to freedom of protection from discrimination. And this is not an isolated incident, right? We've seen similar groups in other states across the country launch similar attacks against very similar amendments. And so, we don't have any fears that this amendment won't be successful in November, but that opposition is there, and if anything, I think it makes at least folks at the League fight even harder.
Well, I think when we talk about, if we're really being honest, when we talk about presidential elections, we really don't have to worry too much because we do understand that people are going to come out. But on the years when you don't have presidential elections and you're having those elections, anything potentially is up for grabs, and that's usually sometimes we see these things right before us.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're lucky, we're fortunate that this amendment is on the ballot. Our legislators worked hard to make sure this amendment would be on the ballot in a year where we're going to see a lot of turnout. But quite frankly, there's also, we're unfortunately seeing a lot of apathy when it comes to this election. Folks just are not as engaged or invigorated maybe to vote for some of the candidates that they're going to see on the ballot. Now I've got to put my League hat on and say, you're not only voting for the president when you go to the ballot box, but there are potentially local election races on your ballot. You'll be voting on statewide races. So there are a number of different races that, you should vote on and that your voice should be heard within. But we're also encouraging folks to, if you're not maybe invigorated to vote for a particular candidate this year, turn out for your rights, right? Turn out to protect your freedoms here in New York State and turn out to vote on the New York Equal Rights Amendment.
Talking with Erica Smitka from the League of Women Voters of New York State, and she's been sharing with us throughout the course of this interview here on the Social Justice Forum. And Erica, when we look at women voters across New York State. What can you tell us about turnout, and what can you tell us about their work?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think women can be lumped in with the rest of New York when it comes to turnout. And the fact of the matter is, New York State typically has a fairly low voter turnout, right? And that's due to a number of varying factors. But the league has been working hard, and will continue to work hard to make sure that folks are registered to vote. They know what they're going to be voting on, and that they turn out and know that their vote matters and their voice matters. And so, we're still advocating to, obviously push women across the state, but we want to make sure we see all voters turn out. And that includes young voters. We have a huge sect of voters that are going to be newly eligible to vote in this upcoming election. And we've got to make sure that those folks turn out, and that, again, their voice is heard at the ballot box this year.
Only have a couple of minutes left, but before we do go, I want to give the opportunity to push in a little bit here, because you did talk about factors, right? Factors that are concerning why potentially women don't come out and vote. Can you give us a little bit?
Yeah, there's a lot of different factors, and I'll speak personally here, but I think some of it is thinking about New York as a fairly progressive state, and perhaps this illusion that when you get to the ballot box, your voice doesn't have as big of an impact, or doesn't matter as much, and that's simply not true. Especially when it comes to a ballot measure like the Equal Rights Amendment, every single vote counts. And historically, in New York State, in many states across the country, we've seen so many races won and lost simply by tens of votes, or in some cases even 1 or 2 votes. So I just kind of re-emphasize to folks, to men, women, people in general, and young folks, that every single vote counts, and every single vote really is important.
Yeah. And for people who want to get more information, what do they do, and where do they go?
The best place to go is either to the State Board of Elections website, or the league has a great resource called vote411.org. It's your one-stop shop for all your election needs. You can find out where to vote, how to register to vote, what's going to be on your ballot, and make sure you know exactly where you're going and exactly who you're voting for.
And you got to make sure to support the ERA. That's exactly what we're talking about here. Erica Smitka, thank you so much for being with me.
Great. Thank you for having me.
All righty. Thank you. We are taking a quick break, but guess what? We got more show coming up right after this.
19.7% of Bronxites currently experience food insecurity. Meanwhile, instead of these nice, colorful foods, this is the best food that they have access to. If this sounds like you, there are a bunch of resources to get healthy food for free or cheap. If you want to help, you might consider donating or volunteering in one of these places. Community fridges like this one are all over the city, and allow New Yorkers to conveniently donate extra food to people who might need it. Go to this link and find your nearest one. Food banks and pop-up events like these provide millions of healthy meals to families in need. These organizations are distributing meals to Bronxites as we speak, and are always accepting donations and volunteers.
I remember when the Bronx did not really have a media outlet properly representing the people of the Bronx.
BronxNet provides for the community by being a community where people can be empowered to share their voices.
We are in a really great place technologically. We've got all the resources that we need to be effective.
Whether it's through cameras, storytelling, editing, we have provided those services for 30 years.
BronxNet's mission is to be a voice for the community.
To educate, to inform, and to inspire.
And you can be a part of it. We've built studios for you.
And we are back. The book, The Gap, I should say, Addressing Inequities for Black Women in Gender Equity Strategies, explores how companies inadvertently hinder the success of Black women, preventing them from realizing their full potential. Joining me now is the CEO and founder of Benefactum Consulting, Leanne Mayer. We thank you so much, Leanne, for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Glad
Thank
to
you for
have you.
having me.
No, listen, I'm. It's our pleasure. It's our pleasure, really, to have you as we discuss this. Because when I think about gender equity, I think that we've come ways, but the fact of the matter is, we still have a long ways to go. How do you view gender equity right now?
You're right, and I concur to the same fact that we still have a long way to go. And I think linguistically, we're still focused heavily on gender equality, which is looking for parity with men, but we're still not necessarily investigating enough the disparities amongst women, which was a motivation for my book, which is especially here, you have different equal pay days in recognition of that. So while we are making progress, there's still a lot of research that still says we have an inordinately long way to go, but I am still hopeful with the work that I do and also with writing this book that we can still continue to make significant change in the course of the next 3 to 5 years.
Well, I'll tell you, if you don't know, I didn't mention the intro, she does have a book, Closing the Gap, How to Include Black Women in Gender Equity Strategy, released in the UK. But when we talk about the fact that what goes on in the UK is mirrored right here in the United States, there's no difference there when it comes to gender equity. Talk to me about how it's the same everywhere.
It is completely the same everywhere. And I think the nuance is the willingness to engage with the topic is the difference. And also to add, the release was in the US, was on the 30th of January this year. The topic is really, when I say evergreen, it's the same challenges that we're facing. I would say the difference in progress is that in the US, there's an openness to engage in the topic. In the UK, you're seeing that same thing. But as we move throughout different regions in Europe, there's definitely a reluctance to really engage in specificity, both organizationally and also from a societal perspective, and even talking about the topic, as in broaching gender equity very specifically and how we can flatten the hierarchy amongst women. And this is a theme everywhere. And this is why we're seeing a lot more organizations focusing, especially within the European space and the UK space, focusing on Black women, because we are unfortunately an overlooked demographic. But from an organizational perspective, a lot of organizations feel as though they don't want to engage with this topic. Sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes it's unintentional, but it still leads to the same output and outcome, which is not creating a culture and an environment that allows Black women to thrive in the ways that they should.
When we talk about not broaching the topic, obviously we know that there's that's a large faction of people who don't want to broach the topic. But let's broach the topic. How do we get to making these addressing some of the systemic stuff that we actually see from a grassroots level? What can we do?
And that's, where I started in my book was context. And a lot of the time we jump into the problem without necessarily spending a little bit more time around the context. What is the context of corporate culture? How did this construction come about? And in many cases, yes, there are intentional situations or unintentional things that happen. But when we look at pay gaps were an intentional mechanism because one of the main women were not openly welcome within the workforce. It was a matter of need as opposed to want. And one of the topics in my book, the chapter is called, Women Positioned as an Intruder. And I think we need to start there. We need to recognize and acknowledge that this hasn't been an accidental construction. Corporates don't accidentally work this way, but it was a very deliberate construction. So once we understand that bit, we can start to say we recognize the problem, we recognize how it's embedded. Now let's take the next step and say, how can we unpack it, unpick it, and start to build solutions and frameworks and methodologies to really get to tackling not just the symptom, but also the root issue.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the key takeaways that you have in your book. For those who don't know, we're talking about the book Closing the Gap. And give us a little bit about your takeaways.
The one thing I want everyone who reads the book to take away is primarily there is something that you can do. And there is a lot more that organizations can do, but it's don't. And the reason I wrote this book is don't ask Black women to be the solutions of their own problems. Black women are the most qualified in the US. Black women are, outperforming also in the European and UK space. But the question is always, what do you need? what can you do to help us better understand? And I'm hoping that the book gives a lot of my readers the insights into understanding, look, these are the things you can find out on your own. This is the part of your. Now take that to ask considered questions, take that to take action. But don't rely on Black women as your source of information to help educate you. And I think that's the main takeaway. The information is there, make use of it, engage with it, but really start on your own, personal journey, especially when you're in a position of leadership, in a position of influence within an organization. But also that it highlights some of the, I'm going to call them blind spots, things that are touted that they do work and help you, such as mentorship, but that they engage with some of the nuances as to why that doesn't necessarily always work the way it should for Black women if you don't necessarily understand what racial inequity is. So those would be my main takeaway. It's there, it's accessible, and oh, sorry.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I want to get your perspective on this, because we talk a lot in the workplace, and there's two words that we use. One is equality, and the other is equity. And many times workplaces will feel as though we've done a good job, and it looks that way because of equality. But the truth is there really isn't equity. And we have this conversation in many sectors, particularly when it comes to the issue of sexism and racism.
Right. And I think there's from a trend perspective, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding that equitable practice doesn't look equal, because if we're taking into consideration the different systemic barriers that are being faced, the point of getting people equal access to the same opportunities, equitable practice doesn't look the same. The solution isn't the same for each person. And I think a lot of people see outcomes and measure outcomes and think, okay, we have more of, that means we've done a great job. That means we understand the root cause. When in fact, they're not. I think I posted this ages ago, but that basically says the cost of me being in a room is I didn't have the same point of entry, or I didn't have to pay the same amount because I'm a Black woman. So that means there are different penalties, different challenges. And we don't always recognize that dealing with those and also solving those issues is a part of equity. We like, it's equal, it should be the same, but we don't face the same challenges, so the solutions can't also be the same. And I think it's a great reminder that equity and equality are not the same thing. We're trying to get to equality, but to get to equality, we need equity first.
Right. So if I'm a woman and I'm out there watching, for our women that are out there watching, what are the tips that you have navigating that workspace, right? Because we understand there's a lot of challenges, and sometimes we don't understand, but you understand. So talk to me about what would be the message for women in navigating this workspace.
Yeah, I would say so. I would say several things, because the other side of the use of my book is take it as a toolkit or a guide to understand some of the mechanisms of bureaucracy within your organization. But my first tip is always observe, because a lot of times observation kind of goes by. You kind of get into your job, you're doing your job, and you're focused very much on doing the doing of your job. But I would say spend as much time on building your strategy. Where do I want to go? Who are the main people of influence? A strategy for a lot of women feels like a dirty word, but it's not, in the sense of be very clear as to how you want to get there, and be very intentional as to how you see relationships, because that can also help you navigate the workplace. I've made the same mistake. I didn't observe enough. I jumped in feet first. And that cost me or two, because I wasn't aware of the dynamics within the team. I wasn't aware of not just power dynamics, but also alliances. I shouldn't say it like this to reduce it, but the workplace is very much like, being at school. You still have to be aware of the cliques, the influencers, and the people who have the possibility to influence your career, both positively and negatively.
Yeah. What about finding your voice? Because that's key in this whole thing. You got to find your voice. So how do I go about finding my voice while navigating the workspace when I know that this exists?
Yeah. The finding the voice part is really interesting. And I think it comes back down to what is your chief communication style? So I am extroverted, so I prefer to speak. Okay, I've written a book, but I prefer to speak, I prefer to make videos. And sometimes finding your voice is finding ways to create the opportunity that shines a light on your strengths in terms of communication, whether it's how you structure emails, whether it's how you decide to reach out to people within the organization, because success in and of itself is not silo. So it's how can you find other people within your organization to be part of your support structure, to advise you, but also to be that sparring partner when you're like, look, I don't know how to negotiate this. There's part of you that has to be the face of what you want to say, but you can't underestimate having a very strong support network as you navigate the workplace. And that's as relevant to me now as somebody who's left corporate to run my own consultancy as it was when I first started out in my career, what feels like eons ago now.
So for yourself, talk to me a little bit about how we can address this right now. If I'm saying I'm in a workplace and a workplace environment right now, I feel like there's sexism here. We know about the pay discrimination. I want to really have a conversation to really address my pay inequity. What advice do you give somebody in dealing with that just right off the bat?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is when it comes to pay, most of the time, you have to spend more time building your case. Some organizations give you, I would say, negotiation bandwidth, but a lot don't. What your pay rises is what your pay rises, whether it's inflation linked, whether they've determined it because of the allocation pool, etc. But I would say before you get to these conversations, don't leave it to the conversation to want to negotiate. Build your case. So if you know that on an annual basis, your compensation conversation is happening in March, start to build your case from that exact point and give yourself a year evidencing the work that you've give language around a team, but what you've done as an individual. Really reiterate that to your boss. Keep track of all the things you do in order to make as much as, well, to the extent that it's practicable, your case for your pay and your compensation to be undeniable. I can evidence all the things that I've done. These are the objectives that I have. I can evidence that my objectives, I've achieved them with XYZ projects. And if I've delivered on anything, I'm not just doing what I should be doing, but I'm excelling at that, then I believe that my pay should be commensurate to that, and I should get whatever the band might be, especially when you're in situations where you feel dissatisfied. So I say build the case and don't leave it to the last minute to think about it. Whole year kind of really being very intentional and strategic about what you would like to get out of it. Now, it's not to say that you may not be disappointed. I think we've all had that. You've expected it, you've built your case, and you're still disappointed. The question then you have to ask yourself, if this repeatedly happens, is, does the organization value, and should I be looking for something else? And that would be my main kind of advice.
The problem is that sometimes I can't find my voice because there's this behavior and this thing that goes on, the subversive behavior that really so many people have become prone to, that it makes me want, it gives me laryngitis. I'm not going to raise my voice. I'm not going to say anything because there's so much of this subversive behavior that's in the workplace. How do I, counter that? Or first of all, why don't we identify what some of that subversive behavior is that, women have to contend with?
Yeah, there are so many different challenges within the workplace that Black women face, whether it's visibility and scrutiny, whether it's lack of authority, people challenging our authority, people not believing in our credibility, and a lot of this goes unchecked within organizations. So when the fatigue is there, as you spoke of before, it's really, really difficult to always be able to name it. And I guess in many cases, this is why I wrote about this in the book, because the impact on Black women in the workplace does contribute to exactly that. And it can also lead to a vicious cycle of exhaustion. Exhaustion leads to, I will call them sometimes preventable mistakes, which feeds into people's biases that links back to, lack of credibility. And I think the reason why it's so important to isolate and highlight these subversive behaviors, because they can also be poo-pooed, as it were, as not being important. It's not that much, when actually the impact and the fallout of it is very, very significant. individual, therefore also significant on the damage or the negative impact on the organizations. And I think this is why, from one perspective, from an organizational perspective, it's important that there is space to have these conversations. But from an individual perspective, it's also creating that space of, and I know it sounds trite, self-care, really taking the time to pour into yourself, taking distance from work, because it has a negative impact, not just in that particular job, but going forward and how you see other organizations, how you even view your career path.
Leanne, we got to get ready to go, but before we leave, please tell people how they can get in touch with you and find out more information about this very powerful topic.
Thank you very much. You can find me on LinkedIn, which is just Leanne-Maya. You can find me on Instagram, which is at LeanneMM, and my website is www.leannemaya.com.
All righty. And where can we get the book?
On Amazon, Barnes & Noble, I think Target, and directly at Bloomsbury, US.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Leanne. Great conversation. Of course, we got to have you back. Thank you for coming all the way across from the other side of the pond. All right. Listen, we're taking a quick break. We'll be right back with more right after this.
So BronxNet is a great place for anyone to come to if you're looking to learn how to get yourself in the door, how to get your toes wet, if you will, when it comes to media, when it comes to editing. And I would definitely recommend it to anyone who really is interested in, learning how to work, whether it's in studio production, whether it's field production, whether it's learning how to operate a camera, whether it's learning how to interview and host. This is the place for you to be. This is the place for you to sort of get your feet wet and be amongst other creatives here in the Bronx who are also trying to learn and develop their own content.
And we are back. In light of the recent events where the debate over transgender participation in sports continues to stir controversy, our next guests have dedicated themselves to protecting and empowering young people, navigating the complexities of identity. Their innovative theory of gender challenges conventional thinking by proposing gender is acquired and shaped by experiences, including trauma. Joining me now is the professor of performance studies and social and cultural analysis at New York University, Professor Anne Pellegrini. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Pellegrini.
It's a pleasure to be in conversation today.
Thank you, thank you. And so let's get to conversation. And when we talk about where we are right now, transgender rights and rights we talked about rights of equality. Mm-hmm. You heard a little bit of the last segment. How do you surmise things, and where do you think we are?
Yeah, I think we are in this very strange moment. On the one hand, there have been, I think, demonstrable sort of improvements in possibility for trans as well as queer people, and that's also produced an extraordinary backlash. Mm-hmm. So part of the pushback against trans existence and queer existence has to do with actual progress, and it certainly increased visibility. And I'll just note that as of May 14th, there have been 515 anti-LGBTQ+ bills put into motion in legislatures around the country, 515. That beats last year's record of 510. And there's still time for yet more bills to be introduced into state legislatures this year. Most of them won't pass, but some will. Some have already passed. But just these particular bills basically produce a conversation of fear and panic. And there's so much focus on trans kids in particular, a moral panic around trans children. And it's very worrisome because it produces a climate in which it makes it harder to sort of be trans. It makes it harder to sort of be genderqueer.
What might people not know when it comes to the trans community and the queer community that maybe we're not, because we're not so, we don't have the behind the scenes approach, right? Like I can tell people, hey, you know, you don't know what it's like to be black, right? Because you haven't had that experience, or a person of color. When what can we say we're missing in terms of understanding some of the challenges that face the trans and queer community?
Right. I think that's a very important question. I think for a lot of people, trans existence seems new to them. I mean, trans people have been around for a long, long time, as have trans children. But partly to do with increased media attention, to a lot of people, the very existence of trans children seems like a new phenomenon. And so when newness breaks into the horizon of the visibility of the visible, many people get scared, they want an explanation, they may feel confused. So, you know, I think partly we need to create space for more complicated conversations, more open conversations about trans children and trans adults as well. There's, I think, a stereotype that circulates, and unfortunately, psychoanalysis, I'm also a clinical psychoanalyst. Unfortunately, there are psychoanalysts who are producing what I would call pseudoscience that contributes to this confusion. But there is an idea that circulates in culture, we hear it in political debates, that people who think they're trans, and especially trans kids, they're confused. Something bad must have happened to them. There was maybe some trauma that caused them to mistakenly think they are a gender other than the sex assigned at birth. And so this notion of a trauma throwing you off course, this circulates as an idea. And one of the things my co-author Avi Sakatopoulou and I are arguing in our book, Gender Without Identity, is that actually trauma, rather than setting someone off course, what would have been normative gender, of binary gender, trauma is actually part of the material that makes up any gender, not just transgender, not just non-normative gender. But it's been really hard to have more complicated conversations about what it means to have any gender, because we are in a really polarized debates around transness and around queerness too.
Do you feel like there's a sense where your voice has been muted simply because of the polarization? Like, you know, it's almost like, I want to say something, but I can't, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we all feel that way. We feel like there's certain things that I want to say, but then in this cancel culture, I got to be careful, because if I say the wrong thing, I'll have tents outside.
Right. You know, I think at this moment where debates are so polarized, and because of, again, fierce opposition to the very existence of trans people, and especially all the focus on trans kids, it has seemed as if, for those of us who want to promote trans flourishing, the only argument we can make to defend trans existence, right, and the idea that trans people should get to have a wonderful life too, it seemed like the only argument we've been able to make is that trans people were born that way. So just as people who are normatively gendered, and the term that's now used is cisgender, so just as cisgender people are born that way, so too are trans people born that way. And that seemed like the only argument we could put forward to insulate trans people from discrimination. But, you know, speaking as a clinician, someone who sits with people, I work with a lot of trans people, someone who sits with people maybe once a week, sometimes 3 times a week, how someone comes into their gender is so much more complicated than being born that way. And the reason not to discriminate against trans people is not because they were born that way. It's because it's wrong to discriminate against trans people. There's nothing wrong with being trans or queer. There's no wrong way to become trans or queer. And we're having a conversation about transness and queerness that is on the defensive, like we have to justify the very existence of trans and queer people, rather than actually having, again, a more open, more complex conversation about, you know, the fact that everyone develops a gender, not just trans people, right? Everyone acquires their gender. No one's born with it.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about the book, Gender Without Identity. It gets you an opportunity to share a little bit about this, because you put your passion and your hard work into this. And so talk about what readers will experience.
Sure. I mean, so this is a co-written book. I co-wrote it with another psychoanalyst. And we both work with a lot of trans and queer people. My co-author has worked with trans kids and their families for more than 20 years. So it comes out of a lot of deep experience. And we've been very concerned about, again, how the cultural conversation about transness and queerness has meant that those of us, again, who are advocating for queer and trans people have to basically submit to the blackmail of born that way, and have not been able to speak in a more complicated way. Many LGBTQ people would say of themselves that they experience their identity as kind of immutable, born that way. But many of us would not. And so, to the extent that many queer and trans people would not say of themselves, they've always been this way, that it feels like an inborn identity, we have to make space for those accounts. So one of the things that Avi Sakatopoulou and I have done in this book is try to offer a more complicated way of understanding what we're calling the acquisition of gender, the development of gender. And one of the things we're saying is that trauma, rather than being something that throws someone off course, so you're detoured from what would otherwise be achieving heterosexuality or achieving that binary gender, trauma may become a kind of energy that you can do something with. And one of the things we do with trauma is actually become any gender, whether normatively male or female, or trans or non-binary. That trauma, when this is not to romanticize it, is something that actually we can do something with. And people, and this is not a conscious process. You're not waking up in the morning and saying, what gender shall I be, on the basis of what has happened to me in the past. But that shifts can happen in us on the basis of what has occurred. And these shifts, and people do shift in their understanding of their own gender. And I'll give you an ordinary example. Over the course of their lifetime, women, someone who's assigned female at birth, someone who's raised to be a girl, who comes to understand herself as a girl and a woman in a way that seems, I'll say, smooth, right? Any woman is going to experience her gender differently across her lifetime through not just transformations in puberty, perhaps she'll have a pregnancy, questions of menopause, but she'll be seen differently by other people at different points in her life. She'll have a different understanding of her gender. Just in that slight way, everyone's gender shifts. Sometimes the shifts are more pronounced, such that people might want a different name for themselves. It really feels like the shift amounts to almost a new form of self, right? And this, I think, a way of thinking about this shifts and these transformations that happen for all of us, also de-dramatizes some of the polarization around transness and queerness, as if trans people and queer people are the only ones who change, and in the wrong way, right? We all change and shift.
So we know now there's a culture of hate. We know now there's a culture of intolerance, right? Your inside perspective on navigating that culture, that becomes heightened more and more every day.
It does indeed, and certainly, I referred earlier to all of these anti-LGBTQ+ bills in state legislatures around the country, which indexes certainly the amount of fear, intolerance, and in some instances we could even say hate. So there is a lot of pushback, and I think it's really important, for educators to sort of basically to get educated on this, for parents to get educated on these issues, and so they can be less fearful about the new genders that are in our midst, the changes we're seeing amongst them, and that this is not a sign of cultural decline. It's not a sign that suddenly, oh my gosh, all these young kids are catching the contagion of transness. That's just not what's happening. We're seeing bold transformations indeed, but this is also about historical transformations, right? This is actually a wonderful thing about culture. We don't have to stay in the same place.
Right, and I think there's a sector of people who have this question about culture and identity, right? Because then you have multiple identities and continue to form and form and form. And so you have somebody that says, oh, well, when does the line get drawn? When do you say, okay, listen, you know what? We've got this identity, that identity, we understand this has come up, but it seems as though every time you turn around, there's another identity that culture's forced to deal with, right? And then I think you get the level of hate, and then you get the level of intolerance, not justifying, right, but understanding the basis of where that comes from, and then you get that cycle that seems like it just never ends.
Yeah, and on the one hand, the positive thing is culture changes, right? Change happens, but there's also pushback when change happens, because for a lot of people it can feel profoundly destabilizing.
Right.
For the terms through which they understood the world to be shifting. And not just the terms through which they understand the world, but when it comes to gender, right, this is also a change in how many people understand themselves. And so for someone who thinks of themselves as, they're normatively, a man, a woman, they've never thought anything other than this, right? They are they've never questioned their own gender. It may be that encountering someone who identifies as trans, or encountering someone who identifies as non-binary, challenges them, because suddenly it's like, wait, what about myself did I take for granted? I'm not saying that you meet a trans person, you suddenly start thinking, wait, I could be trans too. I'm not saying that at all, but I think that when your own self-certainty meets up against a transformation in the category you use, that could actually feel scary to someone. right? Because it suddenly, their world could feel a little bit, I don't know, less certain.
For yourself, talk to me a little bit about the case of Next Benedict. I want to really talk about that because a lot of people have a lot of different views, but I want to get your perspective on his tragic death.
Yeah, and it is just a tragic death, and one that, unfortunately, you know, there's a whole system that failed this child.
Right.
We have a state and then a school district that put in place profoundly anti-trans laws.
Can we walk back for a second? I want to do this for our viewers. Somebody who may not be so familiar with Next Benedict, let's walk through the whole thing real quickly as best we can do.
Yeah. So Next Benedict was a young trans person living in Oklahoma, which has passed some very stringent anti-trans bills, which also one of the things that Next and other students like him was having to deal with was that there was a ban put in place, a bathroom bill, that meant that students could no longer use the bathroom that aligned with their gender identity. It seems as if Next had been dealing with a lot of bullying at school on the basis of their gender identity for some time. And things came to a head when Next was using a bathroom. It was using, I believe, the girls' room. There was no, possibility of another kind of bathroom for this young person to use. Some, hateful things were said to him. There was an altercation. Next was knocked to the ground, head hit on the pavement, and was brought to the hospital. Police were called, went to the hospital, and it seems as if the next day, Next died the next day. There's still some debate how Next died the next day, some question about whether or not I think things are still murky about whether or not this was suicide, whether or not it was a medication that actually was a bad interaction. But I think that we have to look at the entire situation, that this is a school district that failed this child. This is a state that failed this child. And no adults have taken responsibility for the bullying, preventable bullying. No adults have taken responsibility for educating the children that were effectively given permission by adults to bully this trans child. And again, this is a catastrophic and predictable failure, right? And given the imprimatur of legality because of a state law. And I think I want to just say something about bathroom bills that have passed in a number of states. Utah passed one this year. You just had a guest on speaking about the ERA. And there's a really interesting and I think quite disturbing history of focusing on bathrooms as sites of legislation. So right now there is an uproar nationally about bathrooms, and there are a number of states and then municipalities passing bills that would prevent people from using the bathroom that aligns with their gender identity, right? So these are anti-trans bathroom bills. But in an earlier moment, during the earlier period of trying to pass the ERA nationally, there was a panic that the ERA would mandate unisex bathrooms. So Phyllis Schlafly and other opponents of the ERA were saying that among the reasons to oppose the ERA was that if we passed it, there could no longer be a women's room and a men's room. Every bathroom would, by law, have to be unisex, right? So this was part of the panic to convince people that the ERA would be a bad idea. But there's an earlier history to that as well. In the Jim Crow South, bathrooms were racially segregated, right? So this is not just the white supremacist notion that black people were lesser. There was also the specific argument that for a white person to use a bathroom that a black person used would expose that white person to the contamination of blackness, right? So bathrooms have for a long time been this focus of legislation, of moral panics, that something's going to happen there that will contaminate the purity, in the Jim Crow South, the purity of whiteness. And we saw in the ERA debate, and we're seeing now in trans bathroom bills, the purity of binary sex difference, right? We are, again, this is a panic about the purity of dominant identity.
Where do we go from here?
Well, that's a great question. I don't think progress is inevitable, right? So we have to keep struggling. Well, I think that things get better because people actively make them better. I think we need to support trans kids and trans adults. We have to fight to maintain gender affirmative health care for both trans children and adults. We have to make space for more complicated conversations about how anyone comes into gender. Again, we all acquire our gender through a complex set of intrapsychic processes and social influences. We just have to, make space for more subtle conversations, more sophisticated conversations, and over and over, I just want to say over and over again that trans people and queer people deserve a life in which they can flourish, because there's nothing wrong with being queer or trans. There's no wrong way to become queer or trans, and we have to stop acceding to the blackmail of being put on defense that that we have the only thing we can offer is the thin gruel of tolerance, and I think the thin ice of saying born that way. I don't think that accounts for the complexity of identity at all.
How do we navigate trans athletes? That's going to be my challenge, right? And I got to bring you back because I'm almost out of time.
Sure.
But I've, as an athlete, you watch and you see, and I've seen females, who are in competition with trans athletes who are in a male-dominated body, if you will, and to watch the superior athleticism of a female be dominated by a trans. As an athlete, you sit and say, okay, that looks illegal, feels illegal, and then the sum total of that is illegal is what they say. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, a couple of things to say. And I don't hear you saying this, by the way, but one of the things I found fascinating in the debate about trans sports, it's all focusing on trans girls and it's also focusing on trans girls and trans women who are supposedly, the idea is that they're coming in and they're taking away opportunities and victories of, real girls and real women? And so that the debate about trans athletes in sports has been focusing on basically women's rights. We have to defend women's rights. We have to defend girls' rights in sports. What's fascinating is the legislators that are putting these arguments forward, most of them don't give a toss about women's rights. I bet these legislators are not supporting the ERA in their states, right? So I think that there's a ruse happening. There's a kind of bait and switch. The idea that these people are standing up for women's rights, when I think really most of them would not support any number of things which would conventionally be seen to be part of a sort of women's rights, whether it's abortion access, reproductive justice, or the ERA. That's the first thing to say. I think there's a bait and switch. But the other is that, in fact, I don't think that trans athletes have a quote unquote unfair advantage. And also, what counts as an unfair advantage? I think about Michael Phelps, who had extraordinary anatomical advantages over other swimmers.
Right.
And would we say of that person, he had an unfair advantage? He was born with actually just a biological difference, right?
I got to cut you because they're telling me I got out of time. I shouldn't ask the question because I had too much. I didn't give you enough time to answer. I got to get you back. Come back and
Happy
talk.
to come back and talk some more.
I'd love to have that conversation.
Right.
I definitely enjoyed Professor Ann Pellegrini with us. Listen, come to the end of our show today and tell me I got to get out of here. Enjoy this week's discussion on the Bronx Social Justice Forum. Listen, join us next week. If you want to rewatch this week's edition, catch the Cablecast right here on BronxNet.org. If I'm talking fast, because it's got to go. Got to present the conversation, your point of view. Join us on social media at BronxNet TV. Take care. We'll talk to you later.